finance, master's in economics, international development experience for over 20 years. She was working with the IFC as country manager in Nigeria for 6 years, up until very, 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 very recently. And we've been talking about unconscious bias. In fact, we've actually defined the fact that to be human is to be biased. So it's something we shouldn't be ashamed of. It's something we should just be aware of. It's neutral. It's neither good nor bad. It just is. But being aware of it and working on it helps us to be better in the workplace, especially when it comes to leadership. At the core, it's all about leadership. So give me some examples, Eme, of how unconscious bias pops up in the workplace and how we can use it to better ourselves as employees and within the organization as a whole.
Yeah, and the conversation about the workplace is really important, right? Because most of us spend 50%, even more of our time in the workplace. And many of us define ourselves by our jobs.
I noticed that they are manager, director before they're anything else.
Exactly. So it really matters what happens in the workplace. And no one should downplay that. The reality is that it means more than we would like it to mean, right? The workplace, what happens in the workplace. And many of us bring what happens in the workplace home. So not only is it important for what happens to us for that time, we bring it home and then we become different people with our family. So it is really important to think about how bias shows up in the workplace. There are a lot of studies that are really interesting studies on how some of this plays out. There's one that I think is really interesting. This is an American example, so pardon the geographical context, but there's a book by Malcolm Gladwell, called Blink, a very famous book. And he, in that book, talks about a study that was done on CEOs in America. Now, 14% of CEOs, 14% of American males, 14% of American males are taller than 6 foot. Just 14%.
Okay.
Take a guess as to how many CEOs in America are taller than 6 feet.
Okay.
Only 14% of the entire population.
Okay.
Only 14% are taller than 6 feet.
I'm taking it that Americans like tall CEOs. I'm just looking at Steve Jobs. I think they like tall leaders.
60%.
60%
of CEOs in America are above 6 feet, but only 14% of the population
is above 6 feet.
And what does that tell you? That tells you that, I mean, certainly the board is not sitting there saying one of the criteria must be
a tall man.
Yes, we don't. Yeah. But the reality is that the bias of the kind of primordial sense that people have around tall men, which is safety, protection, that sort of thing.
A leader.
It has nothing to do with what we're thinking rationally, right? It's something that we have kind of planted in us and instinctually, right?
Yes.
And it takes somebody to step away from that to say, hey, we're not hiring somebody based on what they look per se, but what they're able to deliver, right? And that study is compelling, right? Because, and it's not just CEOs, it's also very senior people in the military, that sort of thing.
Yeah, government.
It becomes this criterion that people are selecting for unconsciously.
Yeah.
One example of how it shows up in the workplace.
Yes.
We are making decisions. So maybe it's not height in the African context. Maybe it's something else. Maybe it's, it's ethnicity, it's grammar, the way you speak.
Yes.
Right? It's your political affiliation.
Okay.
All these things show up for people and we are unconsciously making decisions. Many very learned professionals will tell you that they're very objective. They're very, very objective. They know how to make objective decisions. The reality is that almost every decision we are making is subjective. It is influenced by our experiences, period.
Yes.
Right? We see something, we hear something, it brings back a memory of something, we can't even access it, and then we make a decision based on it. That is what bias is. That's how it shows up.
Yes.
And so in the workplace, what we found is that in decision making, whether people get promoted, whether they get that next new opportunity, whether they get that raise, whether they get access to, a new, something new or something interesting. All these things matter, right? And that's how bias can play into the workplace, where the person who has access gets that opportunity just because. So another quick example.
Yes.
This will be my management team. Several years ago, we were having a conversation and we were rating all the staff, giving them, we have this barometer, we rate people based on this, they get a rating, right?
Okay.
And so on the management team, one of the most senior people said, "Oh, my assistant is fantastic. She's so wonderful.
Okay.
Man, she's wonderful. She walks on water." This is now our boss,
Yes.
right? So everybody was a bit quiet, right?
Yeah.
And then somebody said, "I don't know about that, And then somebody else piped in and said, "Yeah, in fact." So then we all said, "Actually, that's your proximity bias speaking." Because she's sitting next to you and she can read your every facial expression. Of course, you're going to give her a higher rating. But that assistant who's sitting on the other side of the room, she's down there. You don't see her that often, but she's just as effective. Yeah. She doesn't get that rating because she doesn't have the proximity to you.
Yes.
So people got cute with it and called it proximity bias, right?
Yes.
I'm closer to you, so I know how you think as the boss, so I get the benefits because of that. This is how bias kind of plays into the workplace very, very subtly,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
We're not making, and when we called this person out, she wasn't happy about being called out, right? And we said, "You have this bias." She didn't want to admit it, but ultimately she had to. And that it wasn't fair that you give somebody a higher rating just because you think they walk on water. We're telling you that she doesn't,
Exactly.
right? She walks on your water, but the rest of us, she's swimming like the rest of us.
And one thing that's come up in the past is that people will rate somebody as good or bad, and then you realize people are good and bad based on the person who's rating them. And someone who you may think is very, very good is only very, very good for you.
Absolutely.
I said